They thought the barn was empty. That's what the officers said when they first arrived at the ranch in rural Pine Hollow. Just another collapsed structure, baking under the Arkansas sun, until Zeus, Officer Paul Simmons's K-9 partner, refused to move. He barked so loud, so long, it echoed like thunder across the dry fields. You don't ignore a bark like that, especially when it's coming from a dog like Zeus. At first, no one took it seriously. The farm had been abandoned for months, maybe years. Grass grew through the cracks of the barn floor. The fence posts leaned like tired old men, and the only footprints in the dust belonged to raccoons and the occasional drunk trespasser. But Zeus was on fire that day. His tail stood rigid, ears pinned, chest rising and falling with each bark that slammed into the silence like a warning bell. Officer Simmons knew something was off. He'd worked with Zeus for 5 years, long enough to tell the difference between alert and alarm. This wasn't a drug scent. This wasn't tracking a fugitive. This was different. Zeus's bark had changed. And that sound, it was trying to say, someone is in there. The call had come in around 6:40 a.m. A hiker passing through reported strange noises near an old horse ranch outside county lines. Not the kind of thing that usually merits a unit, but Simmons was already nearby, running drills with Zeus, and figured they'd swing by. The first 20 minutes were routine. The place looked deserted. No signs of a break-in. The main house was boarded up, the paddocks overgrown. The barn door nearly caved in from wind and weather. But then Zeus pulled hard. He lunged toward the barn, almost yanking Simmons off his feet, tail stiff, nose low, growling under his breath like a low motor. Simmons called for backup. "Something's got him going," he muttered into the radio. Inside the barn, dust floated in golden beams of sunlight cutting through the roof. The smell hit them first, damp hay, rust, and something else. Something that didn't belong. Zeus's head whipped toward the far corner. He bolted, barking furiously now, scratching at the wooden floorboards. That's when Simmons saw it. Not a door, not a hatch, just a section of dirt and splintered wood that didn't quite match the rest, like someone had tried to patch a hole. Poorly. "Zeus," he said under his breath, "what the hell did you find?" Zeus was never wrong. The dog had tracked missing kids through rainstorms, sniffed out fentanyl in gas tanks, and once found a man's body in a swamp when even the cadaver dogs had given up. He didn't bark without a reason, so when he barked like his life depended on it, Simmons knew to trust him. The barn was about to give up a secret. They got shovels from the truck. The boards came up with minimal resistance. Beneath them, packed dirt, and under that, something else. A hollow sound. Simmons's blood ran cold. They dug faster. Dust and sweat poured down their arms. Zeus paced in tight circles, barking, whining, spinning like a spring wound too tight. And then they hit it. A sheet of plywood nailed down in a makeshift cover. Simmons pried it up and saw the eyes. For pairs wide, sunken, terrified children. Let me pause for a second here. If this kind of story grips you, if it stirs something in your heart, the kind of courage and loyalty only animals seem to understand, then do us a small favor. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Heroes for Animals. Every click helps share these stories of real-life heroism and make sure dogs like Zeus are never forgotten. Now, back to the barn. The children were barely breathing, covered in filth. Their wrists were raw from rope. One of them, no more than 7, was cradling the others like a mother. No words came from their mouths, only whimpers and quiet gasps. Simmons froze. For a second, he couldn't even hear Zeus barking anymore. The world had gone quiet. Then training kicked in. He radioed. Dispatch called for medics, backup, child services, the National Guard if necessary. He lifted the plywood higher and reached in. One of the kids flinched. Simmons paused, lowered his voice. "It's okay. You're safe now. We've got you." Zeus whined beside him. The oldest girl looked at the dog. Her lips trembled. He barked. She whispered. We prayed someone would hear. Later, they'd find out the children had been missing for almost 6 weeks. Abducted from different counties. Brought here, hidden underground. No electricity, no food for days, no light save the cracks between boards. They were kept in an old horse stall beneath the barn floor, locked away like something to be forgotten. A man, unidentified, had been bringing them scraps until 2 weeks prior. Then nothing, no one came back. They would have died except Zeus heard something no one else did and refused to walk away. That night, Simmons sat in the passenger seat of the ambulance as they drove the children to the hospital. Zeus rode in the back of the cruiser with another officer. The air was thick with silence. No sirens, just the hum of tires on cracked pavement and the occasional sniffle from the little ones wrapped in blankets. Simmons couldn't stop thinking about one thing. Why did Zeus insist on that barn? He hadn't caught a scent on the ground. There were no obvious clues, but somehow, the dog knew. They say dogs hear things we can't, that they feel frequencies humans will never understand. Maybe Zeus picked up a whisper, a vibration, a desperate heartbeat echoing through the barn floor. Or maybe he just knew there were children in the dark who needed someone to believe they were still worth saving. The town of Pine Hollow hadn't seen this many reporters since the tornado of '92. By the next morning, the barn was roped off with yellow crime scene tape. Patrol cars dotted the roadside. Drones buzzed overhead. The quiet stretch of farmland had become the center of a national headline. K9 discovers missing children in abandoned horse barn. The story exploded across social media, cable news, podcasts, even late-night talk shows. It wasn't every day a dog saved for kidnapped kids by barking at a patch of dirt. Zeus didn't care about the cameras. He just wanted his toy. Back at the station, Officer Paul Simmons sat in the locker room, staring at his boots. He hadn't really slept, not since they pulled those kids out of that hole. Their faces kept flashing in his mind, pale, sunken, trembling. And that little girl, the one who whispered, he barked. We prayed someone would hear. Paul rubbed his eyes. He'd been a cop for nearly 12 years, seen overdoses, fatal crashes, armed standoffs, even once helped deliver a baby in the back of a minivan. But this was something else. This wasn't just crime. This was evil that had grown roots in silence. And if Zeus hadn't barked, Paul didn't want to finish that thought. Zeus, meanwhile, was eating a cheeseburger, a real one from Buddy's Diner. Extra bacon, no bun, just the way he liked it. Paul had driven to the drive-thru on their way back to HQ and told the kid at the window, "You ever make a burger for a hero?" The kid just stared, then gave him an extra milk bone on the house. Zeus had earned it. By noon, reporters lined the sidewalk outside the precinct. They wanted statements, interviews, sound bites. Was it true the children were nearly dead? How did the dog know? Can we film with the canine? Paul stepped outside briefly to talk with them. He was polite, careful with his words. The investigation was ongoing. The man responsible had yet to be identified. But yes, Zeus had led them to the barn. Yes, the children were alive. And no, they weren't ready to talk to the press privately. Paul worried not just about the man who'd taken them, but about the aftermath. The kids didn't need cameras. They needed rest, quiet, safety, and the dog. He just needed his ball. Over the next few days, the case grew stranger. No fingerprints in the barn, no personal items left behind. The truck found in the woods belonged to a man with no prior criminal record. His body was identified through dental records. He had crashed a week earlier, likely trying to flee. The coroner listed the cause as internal bleeding. He bled out slowly, alone, unseen. Paul kept thinking, why those kids? Why that place? Detectives dug through hours of missing person reports. 3 of the 4 children had been taken from different towns, all during custody disputes or social service transitions. The 4th, a little boy named Mason, had no clear documentation at all. How the man had gathered them, how he moved them without anyone noticing. It was still a puzzle, but the one thing everyone agreed on, without Zeus, they'd still be down there. Zeus returned to light duty at the department. He was a working dog, but he wasn't just a tool. Paul made sure he got rest, walks, belly rubs from the front desk clerks, and plenty of treats from Officer Linda, who'd started keeping peanut butter in her drawer just for him. But something was off. Zeus wasn't barking anymore. Not out of exhaustion, out of heaviness. At night, he lay beside Paul's bed, ears twitching, eyes half open. Sometimes he let out a quiet whine, like he was still hearing voices no one else could hear. Paul began to wonder, was this guilt or memory or just the weight of a job no one else could do? A week after the rescue, a town hall was held. The mayor, the sheriff, social workers, and a few state reps showed up. The community wanted answers, and they wanted to honor their heroes. Zeus sat on stage next to Paul, wearing a little badge on his harness. The room was packed. Some cried, some clapped, some asked hard questions. How did this happen? How were those children missed? Why didn't someone know? Paul stood and said one thing. I don't have all the answers, but I know this. Our dogs don't lie. They don't get distracted. They don't overlook signs. They don't ignore pain. Maybe we should start learning from them. The room fell silent, and then it erupted in applause. Later that night, as Paul and Zeus drove home, the cruiser smelled faintly of French fries and dog hair. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the soy fields. Zeus sat in the back seat, tongue out, tired but peaceful. Paul looked at him through the rear-view mirror. You know you saved their lives, right? Zeus blinked slowly. Then just once he gave a low, happy bark. The next morning, Paul was drinking coffee when his phone buzzed. It was a message from the hospital. One of the kids, Mason, the quietest, was asking to see Zeus. Paul didn't hesitate. He and Zeus drove over that afternoon. Mason was in a pediatric recovery room, surrounded by stuffed animals and 4 tubes. But when Zeus walked in, tail wagging gently, Mason sat up straighter than he had in days. He didn't say a word. He just reached out, arms trembling, and buried his face in Zeus's neck. And that's when the boy finally cried, not out of fear, but out of relief. Zeus became a regular visitor at the hospital after that. He wasn't trained as a therapy dog, but no one cared. Kids who hadn't spoken in weeks started smiling. Nurses made room in the schedule just for his visits. It was as if his very presence reminded them, you were found. You are not alone. The barn, meanwhile, had been demolished not for legal reasons, but because the town decided no child should ever see it again. In its place, the community began building a small memorial garden. A bench, a plaque, some sunflowers, and a statue of a German shepherd with one paw raised. The inscription read, "For those who bark when others stay silent." That night, Paul sat on his porch, beer in hand, Zeus lying at his feet. The stars above Pine Hollow were clean and endless. Think we did good, buddy? Zeus didn't answer, but he didn't have to. The media had moved on. That was just how it went. One week it was Miracle in the Barn with headlines like K9 Zeus uncovers secret prison beneath abandoned ranch. The next week they were talking about a celebrity breakup and some political scandal on the coast. But for the people in Pine Hollow, the sheriff, the nurses, the neighbors, and especially Officer Paul Simmons, the miracle wasn't over. It was still unfolding quietly, day by day in the hospital, in the heart of a boy named Mason. Mason didn't speak much. Not at first. The doctor said it was normal. Trauma does that to kids. It steals their voices, buries them under fear. But Paul noticed something strange. Mason didn't seem afraid of Zeus. In fact, he seemed drawn to him. Whenever the other officers stopped by the hospital, Mason would tense up. He'd look away, shrink down in his bed like a whisper, afraid to be heard. But when Zeus entered the room, Mason changed. He sat up straighter. His eyes widened. Sometimes he even smiled, just a little. It started with small gestures. The first time Mason reached out to pet Zeus, his hand trembled so hard it looked like a leaf in the wind. But Zeus stayed perfectly still, head resting on the mattress, eyes gentle, as if to say, "I'm not going anywhere, kid." The second time, Mason took one of Zeus's ears and rubbed it between his fingers. That night, the nurse said Mason slept without nightmares. On the third visit, Paul pulled out a tennis ball. "Bet you can throw it farther than I can," he joked. Mason didn't laugh, but he did throw the ball. And for the first time, Zeus didn't chase it. He walked over to Mason, nudged the ball back toward him, and waited. Paul watched the two of them play in silence. No commands, no tricks, just trust. The case, meanwhile, wasn't moving as fast as everyone had hoped. The man found in the crashed truck, believed to be the abductor, had no criminal record. No known aliases. No confirmed link to the children. Investigators were digging through burner phone data, credit card transactions, and grainy trail cam footage from the woods where his truck was found. Everything pointed to one horrifying conclusion. This man had operated alone. And worse, he had planned it. The barn had been rigged. Reinforced floors, a hidden door under the hay, chains secured with custom locks. Whoever this guy was, he didn't just stumble into evil. He built it. Paul couldn't stop thinking about the timeline. How long had the kids been down there? Why didn't anyone notice? What kind of man watches children starve? One night, Paul sat in the precinct long after hours. He had Zeus at his feet, snoring softly. A stack of files sat untouched in front of him. Testimonies, medical reports, case notes. He didn't open them. He stared at the wall instead, at a framed photo of the department's first K-9 from decades back. Wish you could tell me what he smelled, Paul muttered. Zeus stirred but didn't wake. Paul knew the truth. It wasn't the scent Zeus had followed. It was something deeper, a vibration, a silence too loud to ignore. Maybe a kind of energy only dogs could sense. Or maybe in the absence of any other voice, the universe spoke through the only one still barking. The next week, Paul and Zeus were invited to the school district's spring assembly. It was awkward at first. Paul wasn't a public speaker. He stood behind the podium, cleared his throat, and tried to be serious, but the microphone squealed and a second grader sneezed so hard it echoed like a shotgun. Zeus broke the tension. He walked across the stage, sat in front of the mic, and barked once. The kids lost it, cheering, laughing, clapping, and in that room full of teachers and tiny humans, Paul said something simple. Sometimes heroes don't wear badges. Sometimes they don't say anything at all. They just show up and refuse to leave. Mason's progress came slowly. One evening, Paul received a call from the hospital. Mason had spoken. Not a full sentence, just one word. Zeus. That was it. But it was everything. The nurse on duty said he'd been holding Zeus's photo when he said it, whispered it like a secret, then smiled. Paul got off the phone and stared at the photo of his own daughter, now grown, away at college. He remembered the first time she called him Daddy. How his whole world had changed with one word. Zeus, sitting by the back door, tilted his head. You're changing lives, buddy, Paul said, and you don't even know it. Meanwhile, social services had begun working with the kids, finding distant relatives, vetting foster homes, building support plans. The oldest girl, Sienna, had already been placed with an aunt in Little Rock. Two of the boys were being kept together in a therapeutic center with around-the-clock care. Mason was still in the hospital. Part of it was medical, but most of it was emotional. He had no family, no known guardian, no legal record of ever being in the foster system. He was quite literally invisible. One afternoon, Paul sat outside the hospital cafeteria, eating a cold sandwich, when a caseworker approached him. Paul, I need to ask you something off the record. He nodded. What would you think about taking Mason in temporarily? I mean, until we figure something more permanent. Paul nearly choked on his coffee. I'm a cop, he said. I work crazy hours. I've got no time. You also have Zeus, she replied. And that boy trusts no one but that dog. Paul looked away. The truth is, he'd already thought about it. He'd seen the way Mason clung to Zeus, how he followed him with his eyes like a compass. It made Paul wonder what it would have been like to raise a son. He'd raised a daughter. But maybe now, maybe it was time for something new. That night, Paul pulled into his driveway, Zeus's head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. The stars were bright over Pine Hollow, quiet, clean. Paul parked the cruiser and stepped out. Come on, Zeus, he said. Let's get ready. The dog hopped down, tail wagging. They had a room to clean out, a bed to build, and maybe, just maybe, a boy to bring home. The first night Mason moved in, he didn't unpack a single thing. The cardboard box social services had handed him stayed sealed, duct taped like a secret. It sat untouched in the corner of the spare bedroom next to the dresser Paul had cleaned and the bed he and Zeus had clumsily assembled over the weekend. Mason didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't complain. He just stared out the window, while Zeus curled up on the rug like a sentry on duty. Paul stood in the hallway watching, coffee in hand, not sure what to do next. He'd faced down meth dealers, run into burning trailers, once pulled a man from a flip semi in a lightning storm. But nothing prepared him for parenting a silent boy with trauma in his bones. The next morning started at 6:15 sharp. Paul cooked scrambled eggs and toast, figuring it was a safe bet. Mason picked at the toast, left the eggs untouched. Zeus didn't beg. He sat nearby, eyes trained on the boy like he was learning a new language. When Paul left the station, he called in a favor to take desk duty for the week. Mason wasn't ready to be alone. Not yet. He took him to work. Zeus sat between them in the cruiser. Mason clutched Zeus's harness like it was a seatbelt for his heart. The station wasn't built for kids, but no one minded. Paul had cleared out a side office, brought in coloring books and an old laptop, added a small bean bag chair one of the detectives had lying around. Zeus spent most of the day lying across Mason's feet, occasionally raising his head if someone got too close. Mason didn't speak to anyone but Zeus, not even Paul. But when a janitor dropped a mop too loud in the hallway and Mason flinched, Zeus was up in a flash, nudging him with his nose, nuzzling under his arm until Mason exhaled slowly and leaned in. Zeus didn't need words. He was the words. That Friday, Paul brought Mason to Buddy's Diner. It was Zeus's favorite place, and he figured familiarity might help. The waitress, Tracy, recognized him instantly. She bent down to Mason's level. "And who's this fine young man?" Mason looked down. Tracy didn't press. Instead, she turned to Zeus. "You want your usual hero?" Zeus barked softly. Mason smiled. Barely, but Paul saw it. Progress. Later that night, Mason sat on the couch with a blanket draped over his lap, eyes fixed on an old Pixar movie. Paul brought over a bowl of popcorn. Zeus laid his head on Mason's knee. Halfway through the movie, Mason reached into the popcorn and accidentally brushed Paul's hand. He didn't flinch, didn't retreat. He just kept watching the movie. Another win. Saturday morning brought unexpected sun and a soft breeze that smelled like spring. Paul decided they needed fresh air. He drove out to a small field just outside town, an old training site for K. 9 drills. Zeus practically leapt out of the car. Mason followed more slowly, arms tucked close, hoodie up despite the warmth. "Watch this," Paul said, clipping a tennis ball to the launcher. He fired it. Zeus took off like a rocket, legs pumping, tail flying. He snagged the ball midair and bounded back, tail wagging like a fan blade. Paul turned to Mason. "Your turn." The boy hesitated, then reached out. Paul handed him the launcher. Mason fired. Zeus chased. Mason laughed. Not a loud laugh, not a belly laugh, but a real one, thin and light, like it hadn't seen daylight in years. Paul turned away to hide the water in his eyes. That night, Paul stood on the porch while Mason and Zeus played in the backyard. The boy threw the ball. Zeus fetched, over and over, until the stars came out and fireflies blinked like nature's string lights. Paul remembered his daughter at that age, her first soccer practice, the way she cried after missing a goal. He knelt down, told her, "We're not here to be perfect. We're here to try." Maybe that was all this was now. Trying every day, with Zeus leading the way. Mason still didn't say much. But the silence started to feel less like fear and more like peace. He began helping with little things. Feeding Zeus, folding his own laundry, organizing the patrol car's center console. Paul never forced anything. He just let the boy exist. Let him feel safe. One evening, Paul found Mason sitting in the hallway, stroking Zeus's back and humming softly to himself. It wasn't a song Paul recognized, but it was music. That was enough. Then came the letter, folded neatly in Mason's notebook, wedged between doodles of dogs and stick figures. "Dear Officer Simmons," it began, "thank you for letting me stay here. I know I'm not normal. I get scared a lot. Sometimes I forget to eat, but Zeus doesn't mind. He always stays close. Even when I cry at night. I don't remember my mom's face. I don't know where I lived before, but I remember the dark place and the way it smelled. I remember praying someone would find us. Then I heard the bark. I knew we were going to be okay. Paul didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at that note until the ink blurred behind tears. He wasn't ready to call himself a dad. But Mason was already calling Zeus's home. That had to mean something. The next day, Paul called the caseworker. "I want to make it official," he said. "I want to foster him as long as he wants to stay." The woman on the other end paused. "You're sure?" "No one else gets through to him. Just Zeus. And, well, I'm learning a few things from that dog, too." She chuckled softly. "All right, Paul. Let's start the paperwork." By Sunday evening, Mason had unpacked his box. Not everything, but enough. A shirt, a toy car, a plastic medal that said, "Reading Star," a worn-out photo of someone who might have been his mother. He placed a medal on Zeus's collar. "Because you're the real star," he whispered. Zeus wagged his tail. Paul smiled from the doorway, arms crossed. "Looks good on him." Mason nodded. "Yeah." Then, for the first time, he looked Paul in the eyes. "Can I call you something?" Paul's heart stopped. "You can call me whatever feels right." Mason thought for a second, then he smiled. "Okay, Coach." Paul laughed. "Coach, it is." That night, under the wide Pine Hollow sky, with Zeus guarding the front door and Mason tucked safely under covers that smelled like home, Paul finally let himself breathe. He hadn't rescued a child. Zeus had, but maybe, just maybe, he'd earned the chance to raise one. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and nerves. It was Mason's first day of school. Paul flipped pancakes on the stove while Zeus sat by the front door, watching the sunrise through the screen like it had something to tell him. Mason stood in the doorway, already dressed in the blue polo and khakis they'd picked out together at the thrift store. His backpack still had the tag on it. "You sure you don't want her to walk you in?" Paul asked, trying to keep it casual. Mason shook his head slowly. Paul nodded. "All right, but Zeus is coming for drop-off." That got a smile. Just a small one, but it was the kind Paul could feel all the way down to his bones. The drive to school was quiet. Not tense, just still. Mason stared out the window, lips pressed together, fingers tapping the straps of his bag. Zeus leaned over the back seat, nose against Mason's shoulder. When they pulled up to Pine Hollow Elementary, kids were already pouring out of minivans and SUVs. Some wore superhero backpacks. Others clung to parents with lunchboxes shaped like animals. Teachers stood outside, waving clipboards and coffee cups. Mason froze. Paul noticed immediately. "You don't have to say anything. Just go in and see how it feels. If it's too much, you come back out. No shame in it." Mason nodded. He opened the door, but before stepping out, he turned around and whispered, "Can he come too?" Paul blinked. "Into the school?" Mason nodded again, eyes hopeful. Paul looked at Zeus. The dog wagged once. Paul reached into the glove box, pulled out Zeus's therapy vest, a recent addition approved by the station. He clipped it on and opened the door. "All right, partner. Let's walk him in." The principal didn't blink. She recognized Mason instantly and welcomed Zeus like an old friend. Within minutes, Mason was being led down the hall, Zeus trotting beside him. A few students stared. One girl squealed with delight. A second grader ran up and asked if she could pet him. Mason didn't answer, but he didn't move away either. Zeus sat, let her touch his ear. Mason smiled. Paul sat in the cruiser for over an hour, just in case. He kept checking the clock, then the phone, then the rear view mirror. He didn't want to hover, but he didn't want to leave either. Finally, the secretary came outside, gave him a thumbs up. "He's doing okay," she said. "Zeus, too." Paul let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. By the time school let out, Mason came out of the building carrying a drawing. It was crayon on construction paper. A stick figure boy, a tall man, and a big brown dog. Zeus had a cape. Paul framed it and hung it in the hallway that night. That weekend, something strange happened. Mason asked if they could go to the barn. Not the barn, but a barn. Paul had taken him to a therapy center a few towns over that offered animal-assisted care. They had horses, goats, chickens. Mason had never said much during visits, just followed Zeus around the property, watched the animals from a distance, But now he was asking to go willingly. The sky was painted in soft oranges and golds when they pulled up. The therapist, Marcy, met them with a warm smile. "We got a new rescue, real gentle. Might be nice for Mason to meet her." The horse's name was Lily. She was older, with a soft gray muzzle and kind eyes. Mason approached slowly. Zeus walked beside him, step for step. When Mason reached out to touch Lily's flank, she leaned into it like she'd been waiting. Paul watched from a few feet away. "Want to brush her?" Marcy asked gently. Mason nodded. For the next 30 minutes, he combed Lily's mane in total silence. And for the first time, his hands didn't shake. Later, as they sat under a tree eating sandwiches, Mason leaned against Paul's side. "Do you think she remembers?" "Who?" "The horse. What happened before." Paul thought about that for a second. "I think she remembers just enough to be careful, but not so much that she can't trust again." Mason nodded, like that made perfect sense. Then he looked at Zeus. "Is that what dogs do?" Paul smiled. "They forgive faster than we do. That's for sure." On Sunday, they went to the town fair. It was Mason's idea. "I want to try the ring toss," he said. "Maybe win a prize." Paul couldn't believe it, not because of the ring toss, but because Mason had asked. They strolled through booths of cotton candy and kettle corn, Zeus drawing smiles from every corner. Kids ran up, asked if he was that dog from TV. Paul just nodded and let Zeus soak in the attention. Mason tried the ring toss, didn't win, but laughed anyway. Paul bought him a snow cone. Mason shared it with Zeus. But trauma doesn't leave quietly. That night, Mason had a nightmare. Paul heard the scream before he even got out of bed. He rushed down the hallway, found Mason on the floor, curled in a ball, sobbing. Paul knelt beside him, arms out but not touching. "It's okay. I'm here." Zeus came in, laid down beside Mason, pressed against him. Mason clung to his fur. "It was the barn," he gasped. "I thought I was back." "You're not," Paul said softly. "You're home. You're safe. You're with us." It took a long time for the sobs to stop, but they did. Eventually, the next morning, Mason was quiet at breakfast. But before Paul could ask, the boy looked up and said, "Can we go back to the horse place?" "Of course. I think I want to help other animals." Paul paused. "Like, take care of them?" Mason nodded. "They listened, even when I didn't talk." Paul swallowed the lump in his throat. "Well, then I think we just found your superpower." Mason smiled. "A quiet one. Those are the best kind," Paul said. That afternoon, Paul filed the first bit of paperwork to become a permanent guardian. No more temporary placement. No more just fostering. This was real. This was family. And Zeus, he already knew. He'd known from day one. The fall air in Pine Hollow had a different kind of stillness now. It wasn't the hush of fear or the loneliness of forgotten barns. It was a quiet of healing, of a town that had seen something unthinkable, then chosen to rise from it. Leaves skittered across sidewalks. Main Street buzzed with back-to-school banners and carved pumpkins on porches. But for Paul Simmons, the most important changes were the ones you couldn't see right away. Like how Mason no longer flinched at the sound of tires on gravel, or how Zeus no longer needed his vest to be recognized as a hero. They had a new routine now. Mornings began with waffles and dog food. Zeus would speak for his breakfast, a single bark that made Mason laugh every time. Then it was backpacks, leashes, and a ride to school with country music playing on low. Zeus, of course, was now a certified emotional support dog for Pine Hollow Elementary. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he'd trot to the front doors like a furry mare, stopping for pets' kisses and the occasional stolen sandwich. Mason walked beside him, holding the leash, head held a little higher than the week before. Nobody pushed him to talk more, but he did, a little each day, especially when he was with Zeus. Paul had finished the adoption paperwork 2 months ago. The judge hadn't even hesitated. "I've seen a lot of custody hearings," she said, "but this one feels like the kid chose you before the court did." Mason didn't say much that day, but afterward, at the diner over cheeseburgers and fries, he looked up and said, "Thanks, Dad." And that was that. No speeches, Just 2 words that Paul would remember for the rest of his life. As for the barn where it all began, it was no longer a crime scene. The town voted to tear it down and replace it with something better. So that's what they did. With help from volunteers, donations, and even some national funding after the story spread, they built a modest community center. Nothing fancy, just a wide open space where kids could learn, where families could gather, where trauma could be met with tenderness instead of silence. They called it the Bark Foundation, named after the sound that broke through the dark. A bronze statue of Zeus stood at the entrance, one paw raised, ears perked, eyes alert. Underneath it read, "For the ones who hear us, even when we're too scared to speak." Paul never got used to being called a hero. He'd deflect when reporters called. He'd shrug when the sheriff introduced him at town meetings. "It was a dog," he'd always say. And it was true. Zeus was the one who heard the whimper under the floorboards. Zeus was the one who wouldn't leave. Zeus was the reason Mason was alive and healing. But Paul had played a role, too. He'd stayed. When it would have been easier to hand off the boy to a system already full of cracks, he made room in his life, in his house, in his heart. He didn't know what he was doing most days, but he showed up again and again, just like Zeus. One Saturday morning, Mason asked Paul if they could do something special. "I want to visit the other kids, the ones who were rescued with him." Paul hesitated, not out of fear, but out of care. He didn't want to reopen wounds. But Mason was steady now. His voice had strength behind it. And so they packed snacks, printed pictures, and drove to Little Rock, where Sienna lived with her aunt. The other 2 boys were in a long-term care facility outside of town. The reunion wasn't dramatic. No tears or emotional speeches, just hugs. Quiet ones. Sienna had braided her hair and gave Mason a drawing. She'd made a picture of all 4 of them, with Zeus in the middle. "You saved us," she said. Mason shook his head. He did. They all looked at the dog. He rolled over for a belly rub. They laughed, just like kids should. That night, as they drove home, Paul glanced in the rearview mirror. Mason was asleep in the back seat, head resting against Zeus. The dog didn't move, just watched the road ahead, eyes sharp, body relaxed, always listening. Back in Pine Hollow, life moved forward. Paul went back to patrol, duty part-time. Mason joined a reading club at school. Zeus got older, but still had the same fire in his steps when Mason picked up the leash. And the town got softer, less judgmental, more aware. Local leaders funded more counselors. Schools added wellness checks. Farmers who once kept to themselves now brought over baskets of apples and jars of jam to the center. People started talking more and listening the way Zeus had. On the 1-year anniversary of the rescue, the town held a candlelight vigil, not for mourning, but for gratitude. They lit candles around the Bark Foundation statue, told stories, sang songs. Kids recited poems. Mason stood quietly beside Paul, Zeus at his feet. The mayor stepped up to speak. "This isn't just about what was lost," she said. "It's about what was found. Courage, kindness, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes don't say a word. They just bark when it matters most." That night, back home, Mason climbed into bed, clutching the stuffed animal Zeus had torn the squeaker out of months ago. "Dad." "Yeah, buddy. Do you think I'll ever forget it?" Paul walked to the edge of the bed, sat down. "I think you'll always remember parts of it, but I also think you'll keep adding so many new memories that the old ones won't feel so big anymore." Mason nodded slowly, then looked down at Zeus, curled at the foot of his bed. He still barks in his sleep sometimes. Paul smiled. "Yeah, he's probably chasing tennis balls." Mason laughed just a little, and that sound, in that moment, felt like victory. Some wounds never fully close. But with the right love, the right space, and the right dog, you can build something beautiful on top of them. That's what Mason learned. That's what Paul lived. That's what Zeus gave them all. Not just a rescue, but a future. Thank you for following this journey. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to know. What does heroism look like to you? Is it a badge, a bark? A choice to stay when leaving would be easier? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. because sometimes the quietest heroes have the loudest bark. Until next time,